And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gurton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, January 9th. I'm your host, Terry Gurton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, ever tried fixing your own car? The right to repair fight is heating up as costs soar and Congress weighs a national law. Plus, the latest shutdown exposed real problems in how Washington funds Indian country. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. President Donald Trump took aim at defense contractors Wednesday, announcing new restrictions on executive pay and stock buybacks as part of the administration's push to speed procurement and revitalize the defense industrial base. Trump said companies, quote, are not permitted in any way, shape, or form to pay dividends or buy back stock until they are able to produce a superior product on time and on budget, unquote. He also said he would ask Congress for a $1.5 trillion defense budget in fiscal 2027. Federal News Network's Jason Miller and Anastasia Obis are here with more. Thank you both for joining me. Jason, let's start with you. What's in this executive order?
I think the key point here is two things here. First of all, within 30 days of the signing, which was came just the other day, and then continuing on a continuing basis thereafter, the Secretary of Defense will identify any defense contractors for critical weapons and supplies or equipment that are what they call underperforming in their contracts. And additionally, these same contractors are not also investing their own dollars, their own profits, their own revenue into production capacity and what they believe are not prioritizing these government contracts. So I think that's one piece. And then the second piece is these contractors, if they identify them, and they seem to have some sort of list already, they will have to have a remediation plan. And if that remediation plan is not sufficient enough, then the government could take even further action. And this action could be everything, again, from things like canceling the contract to getting the Securities and Exchange Commission involved to so many other things that they could do to really put the hammer down and really put the scrutiny on these contractors. The last thing, Terry, just within, I think is important, is within 60 days of this order, so roughly 2 months, the Secretary of Defense also will ensure that any future contract with any new or existing defense contractor, including renewals, a key point there, contains a provision prohibiting any stock buybacks or corporate distributions, so dividends to shareholders, if they are underperforming, if they're not in compliance of the contract. So I think three key things that we're going to look out for over the next couple months.
Anastasia, what are you hearing inside that executive order about executive compensation specifically?
Yeah, so it's another significant part of the executive order. It's important to note that before this EO became public, Trump said that his administration will cap executive compensation at $5 million. The $5 million figure didn't make it into the executive order, but it does say that the defense secretary has to ensure that future contracts specify that executive incentive compensation for contractors it's not going to be tied to short-term financial metrics, such as earnings per share driven by stock buybacks, and instead will be tied to on-time delivery, increased production, and all necessary facilitation of investments and operating improvements required to rapidly expand military capabilities.
Jason?
What's interesting about this is this idea of executive compensation and capping it is not necessarily a new idea. Without understanding a lot more specifics about what this will entail, we do know that if you go back to 2013, the Obama administration also had a legislative proposal to put a cap on executive compensation. Now, back then, it was tied to certain figures and certain money and certain types of contracts. Now, that legislative proposal never made it through Congress. It never really went anywhere. But there's still a lot of this idea that, hey, why are executives making so much money? And again, that's a difficult question. We all wonder, right? And there's a lot of funny things on LinkedIn when I posted the initial story from the other day. Hey, just pay me instead of $5 million, $4 million, and I'll do it on the cheap, right? So there's a lot of jokes that way.
It is a legitimate conversation to have. And yes, this particular executive order is a lot different from the legislative pushback from 2013. But one thing that this executive order also has is that if a defense contractor is underperforming, if they have engaged in insufficient investments or insufficient production speed, to require that executive base salary of the contractor be capped at current levels. It raises all sorts of questions. This is different because this particular executive order hinges specifically on performance. Like Jason said, it's a fair question about executives having the salaries, but at the same time, how do we define insufficient? What does it mean? By what metrics?
You both have raised some important questions. Folks have been watching for this. It was leaked before the holidays, so it didn't take long for reaction to spin up. Jason, what are you hearing?
Let's start with the first. There's a lot of uncertainty around what the executive order really means. The implementation guidance that we expect to come from DoD within 30 to 60 days probably will help put a lot bigger focus on what this means and how it's going to work. But a couple of things I heard, and I talked to, for instance, David Berteau, a former Defense Department executive, former head of the Professional Services Council. And one of the things he brought up that was really fascinating is that this is not a new problem. In fact, this is something we've probably been talking since the 1980s during the Packard Commission. And in fact, he talked about a Defense Science Board report that he was a part of back in the 2006-2007 timeframe, where they looked at three big programs: the Littoral Combat Ship, the Presidential Helicopter, and the Army Comanche Helicopter. And he says what the Defense Science Board found was the major cause of delays and cost overruns was because the government was constantly changing their requirements, often without regard to the impact on cost or schedule. So the point here is the implementation guidance has to recognize, according to these sources, that this is a shared responsibility, that neither side is responsible for cost delays and overruns. There's always more to it than just says, hey, this contractor didn't do good enough. A lot of times the government is at fault as much as the contractor.
Anastasia?
Yeah. Companies are far from perfect. No one's defending companies. There are a lot of issues, but all too often the delays are driven by changing requirements. They're driven by requirement rigidity, lack of budget, etc., budget uncertainties. So not all cost overruns are created equal. And so this executive order is full of ambiguities. This executive order presumes that any cost overrun is the fault of the contractor without recognizing so many other factors at play here.
Such a good point. Jason?
I'll just add one quick thing. The other thing that the EO doesn't do, according to David Berteau and others, like I talked to Trey Hotchkins, a former head of an association, has been in this market for a long time, is it doesn't do anything to hold the government more accountable, right? There's plenty of ways to do that. And a lot of times that has to come from Congress, which that's a whole different discussion, Terry, and Anastasia, we could go down. But the responsibility, again, going back to, has got to be shared, and it can't just be about punishment. If really their end goal is to get speed to capability.
Many of these defense contractors don't just do business in the United States. They are international players. What impact might this EO have on international defense business?
One of the things here is it talks about foreign military sales, saying if you are underperforming, we may not let you do foreign military sales. Interestingly enough, that would also cause some trouble with their allies, right? U.S. allies, hey, we're trying to send Patriot missiles to Ukraine. Oh, but you're underperforming, so we're not going to let you do that. But here there's a conflict, a war going on that needs these missiles. So there's a lot, again, the ambiguity, the uncertainty, I think, is a real big piece of this. And then the other side of the coin is a lot of the companies, like the president in his Truth Social post called out Raytheon as a prime example of a company that's underperforming. Well, Raytheon, I looked at their 2024 annual report, and it says they do about 52 to 54% of all their revenue from defense. Now, that's not the U.S. Defense Department. That's defense worldwide. So the U.S. plays a small role in their big-time budget, something like $80 billion total. I think the U.S., the government paid Raytheon about $7.2 billion in 2025. So there's a disconnect happening between the foreign military sales side, the global nature of these companies and what the government really can do to stop them from pursuing their business.
Given all of this uncertainty and the short timeline, what are you expecting to see when DOD actually puts the guidance out? Anastasia?
I actually asked the Defense Department about whether contractors should expect any guidance or policy within the next couple of weeks. They didn't respond to any of those questions, but they did share a statement with me saying that after numerous years of failing to meet contractual obligations, under President Trump's order, defense contractors will no longer be allowed to leave our warfighters behind while giving themselves massive payouts from stock buybacks. This will give Department of Defense the ability to meet national security objectives and ensure efficiency and accountability.
Jason?
The one thing about the guidance I think needs to do is answer several questions that I think are out there. Again, when I talked to Trey Hotchkins, he talked about this idea of what is underperformance? How do you define that? What it's a very subjective thing, and who's responsible for that underperformance? And when I talked to David Berteau, one of the things he said to me when it came to this idea of underperformance is okay, what do you do about it, right? Is it, again, it goes back to, is this about punishment or is this about making things better, meeting warfighter needs in an accelerated way and doing this together? So I think a lot of people are going to be watching for this guidance and really what does it say and how does it take this big executive order, which are always very broad, and really bring it down to, okay, how do we implement it? How do we make this real?
Anastasia.
And there are so many big questions, a lot of legal questions here. Can you actually do this? Do they need Congress to do this? And then while we want companies to perform, we want to hold them accountable. We don't want executives to get egregious salaries, etc. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we have access to the marketplace. And he clearly has 5 to 6 companies in mind. What about everybody else?
Well, that's Federal News Network's Jason Miller and Anastasia Obis. Thank you both for bringing us this story. There's certainly a lot to watch here. You can find their story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the latest shutdown exposed real problems in how Washington funds Indian country. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.